Hello everyone, today we talk about the Florentine regimes from Frederick of Antioch to Charles of Anjou. I know that we have covered this topic recently in the regional historical series. This is a different part of the content. It stems from the cycle. It's about sort of more in-depth, more granular medieval European history. This is, however, such an important topic that can be considered an evergreen. It surely is. It's one actually of the few, internationalized Tuscan, late communal Italian topics abroad, and the reason lays, of course, in the fact that we're talking Florence. You know that from last year I started this series on Florentine history, which we had never covered over the years, and it was very much due, so it may sound repetitive, but as you know from history, first of all, statistically this stuff is going to happen. We already pointed out how different content overlaps, but you know very well as my followers how history is always to be further discovered and researched and revised, and especially for the degree that we can't do on YouTube, because of course there are just so many things we can do. We will surely go in the same level of that, basically in every topic that we have already discussed, plus others that we even have to begin. Florentine history is crucial for in this very period. So we're talking essentially between 1250, 1266. It's not even a generation, all right? But as you know, everything changed at this point. We've followed it in the regional series. You have the affirmation of the popolo starting from 1250, the first popolo, then this back and forth of Ghibelline and Guelph clashes in the city that historically, as we've also seen, had been Guelph since the times of Matilda of Canossa, but that during the Swabian hegemony over Italy, and especially at this point when Manfred, in fact, was really in charge after his father's death from southern Italy, there is a further radicalization and also internationalization of this Guelf-Ghibelline struggle, which is, in fact, the most important part of the story, if you want, starting from here, like from 1250 to basically 1320, the 1320s at least. You have the peak of the Guelf-Ghibelline clash, right? Not even the vicious propaganda war that was fought between Frederick II and the papacy compares, in spite again of its ferocity, of all even the more brutal, right, more sort of primitive implications of these clashes. Like the world is changing in many ways. This is, in fact, a landscape getting ever more civilized, not just from Florence, but you do realize that. So I don't know, the immediate generation before Dante was sort of much more brutal and vicious. Even though warfare was relatively more contained by scale, that the peak of medieval civilization had to be fully reached, right? And of course, the Italians would largely contribute to this in the second half of the 13th century. The previous part was really bloody. Some kinds of massacres and probably political violence that do not find parallelism elsewhere. The 13th century is such a crucial moment in history also for many other reasons internationally. So you have the full affirmation of the feudal national monarchies that are at this point taking a leap forward towards a more statile physiognomy. We also made a pretty thorough series about the reign of Edward I, looking at England from this perspective. That gives you a dimension of, in fact, also the foreign intervention that the English were up to, including the one we will see here, the papal machinations. We've seen it especially in the reign of Henry III, right, Edward's father, in order to appoint like a king on a king of Sicily, an English king on the Sicilian throne. It was all one with this broader Guelf-Ghibelline stories. There is really a lot going on. There is the Interregnum in Germany. We talked about that as well. So I noticed that the 13th and 14th century playlists on Schwerpunkt are the biggest ones, and that's the case, right? That's how also the general interest towards the Middle Ages should be distributed. Like I would talk more about, say, the 7th, the 8th century. Those we really have to make more about. But of course, you talk the 13th. For these chapters, it's like a never-ending story. Besides, last summer we made a video about the times and meaning of Montaperti that fits, of course, this today's timeline and also just territorial scope. So we have already looked at the degree of bloodshed and ferocity in which this Italian now fully city-states, right, battle against one another. There is a pretty big series made on the Italian communes in their political and institutional development. While you talk about city-states now, something that they weren't essentially until a couple of generations before, but that now really take on that. In fact, as we were saying before, as other European powers, that full subtle physiognomy. Today we look a bit more granularly, as we were saying at the beginning, at these steps that led from the affirmation of the reaffirmation of Guelph regime over in Florence, essentially overthrowing Frederick of Antioch, to the rise of Charles of Anjou. So again, and it's such an evergreen topic. You're going to say it's banal, but it's important to make multiple videos on this so that you can explore different aspects of the same, and this can help us as handles to connect with many other topics. We'll have I have prepared, by the way, the 15th century couple of videos. I'm not sure. Yeah, sure. There's going to be a couple of videos about the Medici's Florence, right? So after that, we will complete the medieval series for Florence. I'm not sure we're going to pass immediately to yet another Tuscan city, but surely we still have to cover, very importantly, Lucca. That's what I'm looking forward to. Maybe Arezzo as well. Sure, at some point we will make a video about the Battle of Campaldino, also as far as Dante is concerned. There is also that series about Dante you can check out. So again, I'm starting to love the degree of say the breadth and width of this content now, in the level of the scale of video quantity and quality on these specific topics. I hope to unite all of medieval Europe in this way. So, what had happened in 1250? Surely the death of Frederick II, that in the very last years had been gaining steam once again after the defeats of Vittoria, of that is Parma, Fossalta. These are pretty heavy blows to Frederick's cause, that however manages to retake control of the situation in quite influential places like the Marches, for example, within the Papal States after the Battle of Cingoli. There are different supporters rising again in northern Italy. However, indeed 1250 had witnessed another blow to the Stupor Mundi's authority. I made that premise because it does sound as if, in fact, after this major clashes against the communes, Frederick's cause was sort of declining, and since he died, that seems to be the case. But actually, had he lived, like, we don't know how things could have aligned. It's almost mind-blowing to realize how, not just how easy it was to die at the time, Frederick, in this case, what kind of great man could simply pass away that easily, aside from any providential consideration, but also how completely different Western history would have been even had they lived for just a couple of years more, right? The other heavy blow had been Florence. Florence had been acquiring, as we've seen throughout the 12th and 13th century, an ever greater importance in Tuscany. It was really rising as the most important commune. Pisa had historically been more important, but the control on the Via Francigena, the sort of this continental profile, like tendentially hegemonic continental profile that Florence is taking on, especially clashing against the rival Siena in the south, is remarkable. We have listed all the reasons Florence, such a big city, needed an access to the sea. There were increasingly important mercantile banking activities that are really all key here to tilt the favoring balance of this or that part, right? Whether Guelph or Ghibelline, or at least there is a specific alignment that we will revise today as well. Florence embodies in this sense already in part those values of republicanism, right? Or a republican regime that is mostly wary of the aristocratic attempts to establish fundamentally a seigneury that are instead fostered by the Hohenstaufen that try, as you know, to establish, to co-opt like the local rulers, sometimes excellent Guelph leaders that become even more famous Ghibelline ones. Speak about Ezzelino da Romano. I'm planning to make a video series on or at least a video entirely introducing the various Ghibelline commanders of the era. Within a feudal framework, right? The notion is that, of course, the Hohenstaufen have largely failed to subdue say central northern Italy as at large, right? Because the communes are strong, they're aware of their prerogatives, and they're essentially struggling for their own de facto independence, even though they still consider themselves subjects of the empire, and proudly so. They do require these monarchies. However, at this point, the alignment seems, in fact, more instrumental, right? There is the taking shape, as we said at the beginning, these two parts, right? These two factions that really are taking on an international profile. This is not much just about, I don't know, the Germanic rulers trying to subdue the Lombard communes, right? This is to make them pay taxes, etc. This is a broader struggle between the, in fact, pro-papal faction that tendentially backs, in fact, the pontiff's rights and prerogatives on the patrimonium petri, the papal states as they're taking shape quite gradually in central Italy. That includes, in fact, very powerful rulers, as we've seen. We mentioned England and France before, and it would be, in fact, the latter that secured victory at large, especially in Sicily. And then you have an imperial faction that, however, with Frederick takes a very Frederick's death takes a very heavy blow, right? Sicily, however, at this point is still Ghibelline. It's ruled by Frederick's natural son Manfred, that apparently was very much like him, especially as a ruler, except he's not a legitimate ruler because it's Conrad IV, king of the Romans, that in Germany, of course, has collected his father's legacy in a more politically, institutionally official way, and that in fact will come to Italy to die, right, in the fight against, say, in the war that would exist intermittently between the papacy and Manfred, that, however, is the de facto king of Sicily. He will even usurp the throne after the death of his brother from, in fact, the latter son, the young Conrad, that will also die a couple of years after his uncle, as you know, in practically the same circumstances. Hence, Benevento and Tagliacozzo, that the latter I made a video on last September, right, highlighting that's a hell of a battle. The only one to have ever covered the battle. Like, just think about that. Like, one of the major, in the mid 13th century, we have this clashes like Benevento, Tagliacozzo, Markfeld. These are literally the biggest and most important battles in the Middle Ages. Not even a so-called mainstream simplified history channel with those battles, warriors, what all this stuff ever covered it. That's the level of subcultural inferiority that we are continuously bombarded with, and obviously people that are already like coming from the same are further, repressed into that. But this is like the entire European history practically being changed again, like this tip of balance that takes place in this very contexts. Here we will have to digress a lot. Also on German history, like we already talked about the rise of the Habsburgs. Excuse me, drink a little. But at large, as I was saying before, it really never ends. So Frederick of Antioch, who was yet another natural son of Frederick II, had basically enforced his rule into Florence, right? Of course, supported by the local Ghibellines that wanted to be feudally, or at least, in general, co-opted by the emperor, right? It's not like there were, as we've seen in the Florentine districts, many nobiliar lineages that, however, were aware of the importance of communal autonomy. They simply wanted to rule over the commune, but doing it their own Florentine way. That's where the famous episode of Farinata that we will mention before stemmed from. In any case, the balance of such regimes was precarious, to say the least. It's not like you walk into Florence and you dictated the rules, right? There was always, of course, a substratum you floated on, and if the barycentrum shifted, you had to be very wary because you could be kicked out. And this is what happened to Frederick after the defeat that his forces suffered at the battle/ambush of Figline in the Arno Valley. This is close to Florence. These Guelph forces managed, in fact, to tip the balance and to retake control of Florence. We all understand now what was also behind this, aside from the general sense of independence, but there was like a rising establishment that saw now the possibility to consolidate its regional posture, right? Remember, in order to descend to Rome to get the Holy Roman Imperial crown, you had to pass through the Tusculanian Apennines. Florence controlled that. All the major land routes from Central Western Europe to Rome passed through that. So it's all incredibly important. The cause of Frederick of Antioch's defeat was indirectly connected with the one of his father at Parma 10 years before. There, the Parmesan citizenry that had been besieged by Frederick, who had made a magnificent display of power, building literally a counter city, like it was used to do in siege warfare. When you besieged a castle, we also talked about it recently in that video about medieval siege warfare. You literally built. This was very, very much the case also in Italy, where they really took it to the optimal technical level to literally create what it was known as battifolle. This was I think the etymology is literally beating the fool or something like that, but the sense was creating like a counter castle in order to bombard the other castle and literally to support eventually the assault. This with a broader work of fortification. Well, Frederick had literally built, by besieging Parma, a counter city that he named Victoria, that was to signify, in fact, like the Apollonian celestial eagle symbolism of the Hohenstaufen and of the Imperial cause. The Parmesans, however, and this episode also produced one of the most beautiful passages of Guelph propaganda and literature in the annals of the time, came out of the city, like simply walking into the enemy, like the Imperial camp. Actually, there was a veritable engagement, but apparently Frederick was hunting at the point, and the Parmesans managed to take the Imperials off guard. Remember, there were Germans, but there were Sicilians, were other, this case, like Lombards. And I made a video about, actually a couple of videos about medieval Parma, so if you're interested in the story in a more local sense, you should check that out, because it's really, really interesting. We'll come back to Emilia. This is, I say Lombardy because Lombardy is sort of in the Middle Ages, has a bit less boundaries than the today's sort of modern region, but this is a very peculiar. Emilia has a very strongly popular agricultural capacity that informs also the very peculiar type of communal regimes that were among, in fact, the most anti-magnate one, right, in the future times. And in fact, in that sense, the Parmesans were Guelph, as they were loathing this imperial feudal lordship that now was literally knocking at their gates. And that victory had definitely hampered, together with Fossalta, where yet another son of Frederick, Heinz, Enzo, king of Sardinia, that was established as a realm in the Holy Roman Empire at that point for him, right, was defeated and captured by the Bolognese. They were part of this, in fact, Emilian culture I was talking about before. We were very strong infantry, by the way, that even takes on the Sardinian cavalry by itself before the Bolognese own militas arrived to finish off the job. And so there is a bit of this dark end of the Hohenstaufen. And in that case, Enzo was in prison, like in the palace that still bears his name in Bologna, and apparently he where he led, a still courtly lifestyle, but like a lion in a cage. He was apparently also very good looking, Minisanger in his own regard, etc. Even had children when he was in prison. However, as you know, that was not these for prisoner that these men were really made, and that had been yet another major blow to the Ghibelline cause. And that at large, and remember, these, when we look at Parma, Bologna, they're just north of Florence, right, in across the, in fact, the Tosco-Emilian Apennine. And that had sort of lifted the Tuscan spirits and reinforced the Guelph cause in Florence as well, to be able to finally overthrow Frederick of Antioch in this battle just outside of Florence as well. These battles, by the way, all deserve to be analyzed. At some point we will do it, like the Battle of Figline. I think we know very few in general, but let's say, as I mentioned before for Tagliacozzo, like there are some of the major battles of the era that are literally not covered by anyone, and it's sort of embarrassing, especially considering the beautiful setting. We've seen it with Montaperti, the German mercenaries, this Italian nobility, the very strong communal infantry. There's really a lot of stuff, like a lot of also international mingling, sort of supporting cultural hybrid. It's very, very fascinating. In any case, 1250 is such a poignant time because the Guelphs are reinstated, and together with them, the first popolo is established, the primo popolo in Italian. In fact, this was a new constitution issued in the following October of 1250, a constitution that introduced different things, and we will see that the primo popolo, if anything, better in another video from a more strictly politological point of view. But this reform introduced essentially the anziani, so the elderly, a group of 12 individuals tasked with exercising executive power. Additionally, the councils of the 390 were formed to sanction the legislation. This is how normally communal regimes work, right? And Florence had even a much more tendentially unitary, say, statal direction here. But imagine in any other place in Europe, like you don't have That's why we call these city-states actually, because the Italian cities, the Italian communes in the center and the north unite this under a single institution that is the commune. Right? In other countries, it's not really like that. You have the commune at large, but it's a way more feeble idea, and the city is run by different councils or different estates that are practically acting separately, right? Here, the thing is coagulating towards a much more compact direction. Also from a paramilitary point of view, which within the city streets was extremely important. Of course, Florence has its own exercitus, so probably the army, so the levy plus the mercenaries and all what these armies were normally organized. I made a video years ago about the organization of 12th, 13th century Italian communal armies. But in the city streets, it was important to have this ready militia, also specialized with different things like, pikes, the pavises, crossbows, double-handed axes, all this stuff, to create a bit of a problem to the knights. In fact, in the narrower spaces of the medieval cities, that prevented from the full deployment of large formations for of pikemen or in fact of cavalry as they had been in open field. And in fact, there are atrocious urban battles occurring in all these cities whenever a regime is changed, whenever a faction prevails or at least tries to prevail to take on by taking on the other. We've seen recently in those videos about 14th century Florence how the later, in fact, there is this captain established, and the militia is divided into 20 companies, referred to as gonfaloni, and we've seen how these would be reduced. This is just anecdotal, to 19, and then to 16 in 1343. But in a moment that paradoxically witnessed a greater rise of popular force in Florence, that was in the aftermath of the defeat of Lucca against the peasants, that also brought to, in fact, the expulsion of Gautier of Brienne, the Duke of Athens, and so on. We have already seen it just recently. Now, these gonfaloni were like the gonfalons. That is basically a standard, each representing a distinct district of the city. This is a bit like the Sienese contrade that you can still admire in their folklore today in Siena, but like every city had the same. And of course, here, let's say, more complicated because things change over time. We see today it's not quite the same heraldry and broader sense of belonging. There were many smaller elements, but we'll talk about this. In any case, there was a hierarchical principle, like in any traditional society and organization. And these companies were tasked with, of course, safeguarding the regime, but also protecting non-nobles from the violence of the feuding aristocracy. In other words, they protected each one their own district. So these represented the citizenry, right? That is not just like the average guy that, for example, comes to work into the city, lives in the suburbs. These are forces that represent the establishment to a degree. Today we will not digress too much again on the institutional or broader social connections here, because there are the guilds that, generally speaking, back this form of paramilitary organization next to the army. These are infantry forces, right? So they are designed primarily to contrast as militia within the city streets the mounted elite that was pretty brutal, pretty unruly, right? Had sort of the typically feudal, that is to say, mobster mentality that literally leaves like that kind of violent lifestyle, banquets, feuds, tournaments, brawls, like veritable battles. And when these happen within the city, of course, these citizens are suffering because their shops are being destroyed, their activity, like war in general, is all these feudings bringing to significant economical cost. And so they say, okay, now if you try to do that again, you'll see what happens, right? And it's not like they weren't, like, possibly the most difficult thing for people to understand, it seems to me, that they reason in dichotomistic, dualistic, ultimately heretical terms. Like, I don't know, every time they see, they have to counterpose, I don't know, the guy on horseback with the guy on foot, as if they had been indoctrinated by Marxism, and so class struggles everywhere, right? If you have that mindset and you profess yourself to be a conservative, sorry to to ruin your fantasy, but you do not have the palest idea of whatever European tradition you would like to think. This is fourth estate, subcultural mental illness plus radical ignorance. It has absolutely anything to do with an objective, accurate historical, political, military, and social view. The divisions were vertical here, right? I know that Marxists make leverage on lesser people because they prey on their own paranoia to believe that there is always the evil guy at the top and distrust spitefully any kind of authority, except ending up under ever more crushing authority because they are weaker, not because the authority is stronger, actually. But when you look at this, it's not like the communes or the citizens were, I don't know, the modern secular leftistic democracy that were trying to alter the great tradition. These citizens specifically were the flower of the Romano-Germanic sense of nobility and freedom in arms that had survived actually only de facto in the Italic kingdom, and that had produced all the disasters for the imperial initiatives to try to curb them. All right, this is very often also in an ethnic sense. People have this notion. Sometimes I get all these messages when I talk about the Carolingians or the Ottonians, as if this was literally the First Reich, and it was a sort of, but in the 24th nationalistic and or socialistic souls, whereby there is a dominant Germanic master race that lords over, I don't know, all the rest of the world, as if, by the way, those lands weren't radically underdeveloped, and actually the flower of civilization existed in de facto the post-Roman, and so Romance lands, as a matter of fact. So they have big difficulties in reconciling this dynamic with, including the Guelf-Ghibelline one, right? There's this wide amount of Groypers that seem to be thinking that essentially everything had to go well for the Ghibellines just because they were following the manual, right? That's not how it happened. Even the Guelphs were technically Ghibelline. I don't know how to explain this to you, but none of these people were thinking to leave without an emperor or to oppose especially in this generation, like the sense that they were proud subjects of the Holy Roman Empire that their rulers had to safeguard was the stronger engine behind all this. And when, in fact, the Ghibellines failed, because they did, and the French arrived and also began to rule in a much less oppressive and much more liberal way than those others had done, this civilization boomed, right? I mean, these were the richest people, the most educated people, the ones with the longest life expectancy. This is the cradle for also the Renaissance. And so even though that I'm very Ghibelline in a broader sense myself, it's not like you can twist history, because you don't see in there the merit of the Ghibellines and what they were doing, not for this kind of meme that you need to cram into historical wishful thinking, right? This is serious stuff, and it marks some of the most important steps in the history of Western civilization. If you don't know this history, it's going to be extremely difficult for you to have any grasp of any kind of history of any era, right? And this is valid also for many other topics, but they are all necessary. You can't do without them. You can't select them out. You can't say, okay, well, no, I don't want to watch this because I don't know, I think it's not too ethnic for me. It's your problem. This is ethnic as hell, telling the truth, had you a more balanced cultural background. But the problem, as always, especially on YouTube, it's not like you can't ask for too much. So this first bubble, by the way, grew in significance as an institutional component, if not the foundation of the Florentine state. I mean, the capacity of these people to keep out these tendentially nobiliar lineages from the countryside that had been, by the way, defeated in the previous generations by the commune, and that now were being backed by the Hohenstaufen in order to sort of re-enter, at least to take over once again the control of the regime, at large failed. Right? They failed, of course, also because of other battlefields in which all, for example, like in the aforementioned Benevento, Tagliacozzo, we'll see it now, the same Tuscans, right, the same Guelphs participate as well. So it's not, it's part of the broader struggle between the Germans and the French, for example. It's a lot of stuff that we have documented also in terms of difference in military cultures, etc. But it's also, it's a very balanced struggle in many ways. But you can't simply ignore the outcome. And the outcome is the one of course, citizenry that remains proud. This is evident from the various Guelph, even more also the black Guelph authors that look at this nobleman, right? They had, of course, houses. That's why you don't have to cut, say, black and white thing. Like these guys were citizens of Florence. They had been obliged to become, by the way. And if they had ever remained out of the city, it was because they had been sort of the losers of the situation. Because, of course, the city was run by an oligarchy, was run by an aristocracy, right? The point is that it was done in a joint way with different groups, right? And the Florentines were pretty much paranoid at the idea of having a guy that could simply take over and eliminate all these others in the process, right? Which evidently for a regime of this kind, it was, at least with the characters it was increasingly developing, was in that sense ever more likely. That's also why you find this strength manifesting, but still something that could be curbed, right? Authority and power are of those who actually get it in the end, not those that are supposed to have prefixed formalistic, structuralistic characteristics. It's not even as if, by the way, the Ghibelline side did not have a merit. It was, of course, the original imperial Catholic Roman tradition pursued by the Hohenstaufen in the most purely and metaphysically and ethnically essential Roman meaning and intimate meaning of it. That was the one to recompact the world under a single rule. The problem is how you do it, how you achieve it. And admittedly, the Swabians also, together with the Ghibellines, were pretty close to that. And it's the great chapter, the great Catholic tradition in many ways, right? That's so important. And there is some, like Frederick, for example, was an enlightened ruler. If you look at his sources, that, by the way, every time you research, they tell you something, you realize he had actually a very strong sense of statehood, of civil order, of concentrated power. So he knew his deal, right? So it's not like the Florentines were, again, pursuing a dichotomically opposite direction to the one of Frederick, if not by being the smaller guy that tries to escape, like the bigger power, right? But the ultimate end of how to achieve this, civilizationally speaking, was the same, right? Or at least they had different means and ways to achieve that, but the ultimate goal was in many ways the same. There is surely some of that aforementioned modern secular mindset, like the popular regime, the popular constitution, and say better, with the guilds regime, that were also made of people that, again, were the same ones who went at war, did fight on horseback, who had that kind of aristocratic lifestyle, was mostly intention at developing the economy, right, serving the interests of merchants and artisans, but only in a manipulative essence, like maintaining an hegemony over them as the bigger guilds over the smaller ones as well, but allowing these to grow, not to actually develop this hyper demanding fort like that would have thwarted those initiatives. So it's actually not so straightforward, because a typical American conservative follower of mine could think, I don't know, maybe he is conservative. He's saying, okay, the Ghibellines were the better one, but I mean that you see what the Guelphs here were pursuing was literally like paying less taxes, making people earning more, which is so Americanly, I could say, economic in mindset in many ways. So that's what I would like to present you here. Is not like a relativistic or skepticistic notion. Like, on the contrary, like a quite concrete picture of what was going on in an objective and concrete way, but to make you understand how much the categories you're habituated to are completely useless if not properly contextualized in an actual, not in, again, a fantasy historical context. And an actual historical context is not the one you think after having studied for a year or two, or having read 20 or 100 books. It has to do with real historical study for a very long time, right? So it's incredibly difficult, believe me, this is the majority of the effort I'm making here, to tell this story in a way that makes sense, in spite, in fact, of its enormous complexity, which doesn't mean you can't control it, you can't dominate it, right? But it's also intuitive, right? If you don't understand why a polity is doing what it's doing, if you don't understand sort of the malleable, the fluid sort of level of political action, what kind of leverages, what kind of bets, what kind of investments certain powers are making, and why, that derives from also a scarce understanding of today's politics, and of also just practical awareness of how the world works to begin with. So that's why history is so important, because it provides you with at least that amount of stuff we have already studied to an important degree, evidently, and especially in this case, like, we know how things went, but the interpretation of it for your own mental training is a completely different story. And that's why I make all these videos, by the way, because otherwise it wouldn't make any sense, right? I would leave you with just like the 50 minutes long simplified history. Again, yes, it's not like I hate it. It's just I find it so ridiculous as a self-presentation, simplified history. So what is it? The history for the chicken brain, is that what, like, people were dumbered on a bag of hamsters? Like, why can't it be like a better actual qualitative history, right? Nobody knows. Anyway, but of course they don't know history themselves, so that's the actual point of the story. Now, although it did not yet dominate the communal government as it would in later years, the returning Guelph faction was a considerable influence on civil policy, especially during this decade that goes from the Battle of Filiene in 1250 and the Battle of Montaperti in 1260. These are 10 years in which the Guelph regime rules in Florence and founds its very strong, in popular mentality, lays the groundwork for this advanced civil system that will, in fact, survive, will be able to rise from the ashes of the Ghibelline regime that would last for several years after Montaperti, and that, in fact, will not be able to dismantle the previous system that, in fact, the same Ghibelline regime began to use to a degree, even though the temper, the political balance was quite different. We will see who those people were. They were true Florentines. This is the point. Like, even the nobiliar element that wanted to tendentially take over in a more autocratic but not monarchic way, even the Guelphs at some point will try that. At least some Guelphs. Look at Donati, for example, Corso Donati. Still recognized as viable, as serviceable, as useful, right? So the notion that now because the thing evolved over time, the Papa was not always the same. We've seen, especially in the most recent videos about the 14th century, how that had transformed into an oligarchy, but in the mid-13th century, such constitution meant really the guarantee of certain civil liberties for the citizenry in arms, right, that routinely contributed to the efforts of the commune, politically, militarily, socially, and it was all one with that. So you couldn't and wouldn't waste that potential from such prominent position like the Florentine one in Italy and in Europe. The death of Frederick II in late 1250 and the revival of an alliance among Florence, Lucca, and Genoa as Guelph powers in 1252. After, by the way, Siena, Pistoia, and Pisa, the Ghibelline powers of Tuscany formed an alliance, set the stage for renewed tensions, of course, between the two parts in the region. These were powerful cities, like Florence allied herself with Lucca, that was enemy with Pisa because they're so close, and Lucca is almost on the sea, and as we've seen, close to Pisa, that at the mouth of the Arno Valley, that Florence would like to see open. At some point, there were even agreements between the two cities in moments of different, of emergency for granting Florence's access to the sea. Genoa was at this point the rising force, as you know, also against Pisa at sea. Genoa did not mingle with the sort of terrestrial affairs, but as you know, in 1284 there would be the final victory of Genoa over Pisa. The latter was not really knocked out, was not really destroyed as a power. On the contrary, it went on for a long time, mostly the loss of Sardinia in the 20s of the 14th century that really changed the game. Siena was, as we were remembering before, the arch enemy of Florence. At this point, fiercely Ghibelline city. There were so many, even ethnic identities involved. They're technically the same people, Tuscans and etc., but their municipalism was so strong that they invented all the kind of stories and past divides and cultural legacies to be at each other's throat for the control of the road of France, the road to Rome. Pistoia was also a pain behind for Florence because it's just next door to it in the northwest. So she's also along the Arno Valley, so it's yet another layer that separates Florence from the sea. So you see, even just from this, geopolitics does not exist, by the way, but if you look at this on a map, you immediately understand also what the deal here is. It's a massive containment of Florentine power at a continental level, with some attempts to unhinge the situation from the sea, because this chain of Ghibelline cities around Florence was still strong to be broken just per se. This conflict evolved into a struggle between, in fact, two opposing city coalitions rather than just a dispute between papal and imperial factions. So you understand why the Guelph and Ghibelline struggle, even the same Italianate term for what were, as you know, German names, was finally affirmed, because now the theater of the imperial papal struggle shifted, and here that is also mixed, because again the Germans are almost out of the picture. However, that power is incarnated by Sicily now, but it's not the Po Valley anymore, it's not Lombardy anymore, it's Tuscany, that during the wars between, in fact, the Hohenstaufen and the Lombards had a relatively defiled, still important, but still sort of secondary role, right? All is being sort of played here, also because we will see with Manfred now, if you really want to hegemonize Italy from Sicily, you have to pass through the central portion of it. that is also the one where the papacy lies. So if you control Naples and Florence, of course, Rome is a bit surrounded, especially when you have the control of the seas, which is, however, complicated because Pisa is still active, as we were saying before. Rising internal conflicts resulted in some Ghibellines leaving Florence in 1251, by the way, because there hadn't been like a massive proscription yet, which rather happened as late as 1258, witnessing just what we were saying before in reverse. That is to say, when the Ghibellines took over, it's not like they could do simply without anything that had existed before, that the other regime had done equally. This was true for the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. By the way, all the struggle here, we mentioned briefly that the maritime republics, was truly a matter of international connection, given that the Pisans and the Genoese were installed in the various Tyrrhenian ports and beyond. They habitually clashed with each other at sea, like in southern France, in the Levant, right? So everything may change from a moment to another. Everything is that unstable and dangerous, right? So the resurgence of a strong monarchy in southern Italy under Manfred, Frederick II's illegitimate son, in 1254, led to the aforementioned exiles from Florence. In other words, the Guelphs freaked out because they realized that Manfred was pretty strong. Of course, he was taking contact with the major Ghibelline leaders living in Florence, in Tuscany, and the Guelphs become intolerant to their presence and they're expelled, right? Naturally, all this brought to that specific dynamic known, let's say, of the exiles, the fuoriusciti in Italian, which means those who were literally sent out. There are people who are banned, in fact, from the city, and that take refuge, however, in this case, with the Guelphs expelling them, in the Ghibelline communes, especially Siena, that was the most directly involved in the war with Florence and could thus also intervene better in the Florentine district as far as the castles, the possessions of these exiles were still, in fact, controlled largely by them. I made multiple videos about the struggle over the comitatus, the district, which is a bit like the eternal issue of these communes. So even though they are states now, it's not like they ever fully to 100% control the district. Even when they have like a strong control over other cities, we're not in the 19th century nation state. You don't have full uniform civil law control over these lands. Everything is negotiated, right? This will last for a long time. We'll see now also what kind of lineages lived specifically in the Florentine district that tended to be Ghibelline, and also in an important number because the Apenninic hinterland, the mountains are just there, and those are very difficult territories to venture in. Even for the communal army, it takes forever. Like, you literally have to take out a castle at a time. You can't do it with major strongholds, if not by mobilizing really large swathes of the people. It's very important here. Not just, by the way, the citizens are involved, but the peasants. Right? They form the army. They're actually good. Like, we have this beggar kind of ragamuffin idea of, you know, medieval armies were mostly composed by peasants. Yes, but these peasants were pretty darn well equipped, for example, and drilled. Like, so they were motivated by this local feuds as well. That's why you can never end. Speaking of this, because there is always food for another video just thematically on this topic. Siena, this is the most important thing. Siena was, however, increasingly arising as the protector of the Ghibelline Florentine exiles. For all the aforementioned reasons, they were essentially the only power capable of fueling warfare, guerrilla, on the same Florentine territory, and vice versa. by the way. There is all a chain of castles that Siena and Florence were battling over, and there were coups, regime changes, smaller communes. Again, all things we should digress on, but we can't for reasons of time. Finally, this Ghibelline block had the best of the Guelph one. I dedicated an entire video to the Battle of Montaperti that we partially reconstructed tactically speaking, but that was mostly like a historical, political, and cultural introduction to the battle. We will in fact analyze with all the sources available in another video. Very interesting clash. We do not know too much because at this point historiography was just a generation or a bit less, at least considering that even this later authors would write adequately of some battles, or even a few years later, from allowing us some tactical reconstruction of the battlefield. Sometimes we don't know even things like where cavalry was compared to infantry. This is very important because these armies were importantly evolving, and you can argue actually that great part also of the Italian infantry development would pass through the final Guelph victory, which definitely seemed as far as ever on the bloody day of Montaperti. But just for the record, consider that the Florentines had an army 30,000 men strong. I'm going to make a video actually about this story, that people think that medieval armies were kind of small for some reason. If you want to be proven wrong, make the list of the tens of thousands scaled Italian armies between 1250 to 1350, and then we will have a talk about that, and I promise you that I will bring that up because this thing must end. It's ridiculous how we have handled medieval history up to that point. I'm incredibly dissatisfied with the major scholarly poster existing, or better, non-existing, but certain names I can't mention, also because I'm trying to publish in the currently in a journal that is run by the same people, and I hope they haven't quite read. Yes, they technically haven't read yet in some articles of mine I polemicize, let's say, with the new military history, and in one that I will have to that is going to come out, I think, in a month or so. I'm pretty, say, offensively critical of certain figure, but I will not make any names. I will just come to debunk his work at other times. But I will explain also in due time all the story. Manfred's intervention was behind, of course, the Ghibelline Sienese victory of Montaperti, which also in fact the Ghibelline Florentine exiles participated. In fact, Manfred had sent 800 German cavalrymen under Count Giordano, that we will see now who he is. He's a very interesting figure, that had this spearheading role. Right, the German cavalrymen were pretty darn good. They were at this point essentially surpassing the French, or at least reaching the French, possibly surpassing them in the later era in terms of shock force and coordinated flank attacks and stuff like that. There was a great competition between, in fact, the Guelphs and the Ghibellines as far as this respective French and German support was involved. The Kingdom of Sicily had basically decayed through the various wars and invasions carried out by the papacy. The original feudal levy, of course, by this point in history, also in other countries, had given way to a more practical way of rising armies that was simply to gather money that were increasingly in terms of monetary circulation and buy mercenaries. That's why essentially the Sicilian army had, of course, the local noblemen, etc., but at large it was difficult and burdensome just to mobilize, practical. So Manfred would, just like his father, hire German mercenaries, that are still relatively contained in number in Italy at this point, but as you know, they are an old presence since ever. Basically, it's not even the Swabians of Civitate. It's literally like ever since like the Germanic invasions, right? But this 800 strong contingent is really something. It really provides the Sienese army that is inferior to the Florentine with this punching capacity. It's a very well played out plan. There are even within the Florentine army some forces that betray, like in favor of the Ghibellines. So you can't disjunct politics from war. Bloody battle. The Florentines get exterminated. Famously enough, Dante will tell us that the Arbia River that streamed nearby turned red in the blood of the Guelphs. This caused immediately like regime change in Florence that was taken over by the Ghibellines. A little word about the Count Giordano. I'm not sure we will insert him among the more famous Ghibelline leaders in that video I want to make, but he's a fascinating guy because he was Count Giordano, known as Giordano d'Anglano or Giordano d'Agliano, an Italo-Swabian count and soldier from Piedmont. At least he was born there. He was a cousin to Manfred of Sicily through his mother, Bianca Lancia, and served as Manfred's marshal. They're a guy with massive attributes at the head of the aforementioned Germans. In 1260, Giordano was dispatched by Manfred with the latter to serve with the German knights to serve as vicar general and captain of Tuscany, following the request from the commune of Siena that felt pressured by Florence, that had already, as you know, actually had attacked Siena in this case. They did it twice during the same season, showing also, by the way, how rich and powerful this Guelph, tendentially mercantile regime really was. And this was an unprecedented move because the Italian communes did not usually like march on one another. They were too well fortified. Made lots of videos explaining this. Also one recently about the so-called Circle walls fortification, some of the most important landmarks in medieval civilization. But Florence was that powerful, and Siena freaked out. In fact, they were lucky. Well, of course, the Florentines may have not attacked them in the first time, but they gave the Ghibellines time, first of all, to realize that the Florentines could do that, and to ask and receive this help from Manfred. By the way, the Sienese attacked the Florentines the second time, or at least, I mean, in a tactical sense, because strategically the Florentine army had arrived at the gates of Siena. In fact, Montaperti is just like in the nearby. And Giordano's duties included, of course, leading the allied forces of Siena, Arezzo, and Pisa against the Guelphs, because all these armies were more or less coalition forces, like in the Middle Ages. So imagine, even politically speaking, what kind of person you had to be. Your blood here had to be mixed with the Swabian one. You had to have this very strong, of course, Italian cultural, political, and military awareness. He was the guy that, after the victory at Montaperti, was tasked by Manfred and the other Ghibelline cities of Tuscany to crush Florence. I mean, we basically risked Florence to be razed to the ground after Montaperti. This is the moment in which Farinata degli Uberti, at the Council of Empoli, stands his ground, and this was the head of the Ghibelline Florentines, and he said, "No, you have to pass on my corpse to do so." And Dante, that was namely Guelph, even though he was de facto Ghibelline, remembers him and says, look, he was a rival of his family back. I mean, Dante was not there yet, but I mean, the general background where he came from in Florence, that had suffered also from the devastations of that occurred to the Guelphs when the Ghibellines came back to the city. It admires him greatly for saying these were men with balls, right? These were massive knights. They incarnated the perennial, traditional Indo-European nobility, right? Farinata is a nickname which stems from farina, that is flour, because this guy had apparently blonde platinum hair. His name was Manente degli Uberti. Uberti, you hear it also from the name. These were at least originally Germanic clans that had installed themselves at the time of Charlemagne, at the time of the Ottonians, and that also what mixed with the Longobard nobility. All these sources are incredibly attentive to whether you were blonde-haired, blue-eyed, which is oddly in tune with what we've seen also for the disproportionately fair-haired, blue-eyed representation in the Roman Italic sources, that people have been brainwashed into thinking the opposite as well. By the way, as if every Roman Italic person was a tanned guy with dark hair, dark eyes, and nothing else existed ever in antiquity. This is a mental issue. That's not like just a matter of cultural literacy. It's literally, I mean, you literally have no idea in the world you live in. Secondly, manente means, it comes from Latin, means manens, which means the guy remains. And so like Dante's name is like Crassus, it's Durante, which means durable, right? And so these were names typically connected to the perennial tradition of the idea of there is the higher nature, right? In the doctrine of the two natures, of the imperishable, of the divine. So these were of that specific stock, and this guy was literally even blonde platinum hair, and he passed for the cockest guy ever in terms of, capacity to save Florence against everybody. In a moment in which Florence was just at the mercy of this group, he stands out and says, no. And this is in fact what happens with regime changes, when people, fanatics, lesser people mostly expect that everything is going to change. What existed before had no validity. Now the guy will arrive and will change our international politics. No, they won't. Because who is in charge follows a specific path that, regardless of mistakes, is the more rational one. The people are not better than those who govern them, right? And there is here a centrality of Florence that not even the Ghibellines can do without, right? And of course, yes, the struggle between, say, Florence and Siena and Pisa remained, but now these Ghibellines wanted to run Florence their own way, and so now it's a problem of the others as well. So yes, the Guelphs are crushed. This goes at the detriment of their general international axis. Manfred scores such a great victory in this regard, but the Florentines rule Florence here, right? By the way, Count Giordano died in 1267, by the way. Following this Guelph defeat, the Guelphs in fact abandoned Florence, allowing the Ghibellines to return in triumph. There were all the various measures taken at this point. Some people could remain, mostly the wives, the children of those who had fled, that had in fact all their properties there. Many of these would be actually destroyed. That was the habitual practice. It was like these guys had built castles within the cities, and in part like those had to be torn down. Of course, there is a similar policy in the countryside, but remember, in the latter it's all much more complicated. The city is the veritable cornerstone of the land. Under the leadership of Guido Novello from the Guidi counts, these were a very strong feudal lineage living in the northeast. They were Ghibelline like hell, and Farinata reportedly urged Novello to prevent his faction from destroying the city as suggested by Manfred. Those who had lost power in 1250 regained their influence. By the way, Novello as a name means novel, new. It's part of the same perennial tradition that those guys abided by. Remember, right, when you study this stuff, mostly they tell you, it's the people, the shoemakers. No, guys. Like here, okay, of course, they are Ghibellines, that's another story, but the Dante again was among the Guelphs, the culture that impregnated this entire world was purely traditional. It's like everybody knew that. You see the frequency of the names. It's not just some vague hint at that. Like, there is a reason if I bombard you with this notion, because it's real and you have not been told. And this is a crime against history. Now, the Ghibellines expelled their opponents, confiscated their assets, demolished their residences, as we've seen, and reinstated the authority of the traditional pro-imperial aristocracy, which did not mean, as we've seen, also just, some imperial officials stomping their boots onto this guy's necks. On the contrary, it was just the same Ghibelline Florentines that were essentially aligned with the Ghibelline bloc, and starting to favor, in fact, those centers that had previously backed them. For example, Siena, Pisa, the Kingdom of Sicily. Oh God, something has changed. Yes, Farinata stood his ground when it was really being discussed whether Florence had to be wiped out from the face of the earth or not, but he had to give those guys something. It was just also his own interest in the general level of connections he was pursuing. The exiled Guelphs, driven from their last stronghold in Lucca in 1264, sought help from the papacy. Lucca was, as we've seen, a Guelph stronghold. It had initially backed Florence. She will actually come back Guelph later on. What happens in a couple of years here. In fact, it's now the turn of the Guelph powers to intervene. The papacy is freaking out because of the aforementioned reason. It means Sicily and Tuscany are Ghibelline, are pro-imperial. Clement IV was elected Pope the following year, and he accepted the support of a faction that had developed amid the Florentine economic expansion of the 50s, the 13th century, particularly from various banking families that had gained wealth and influence through their financial dealings. That mercantile and banking establishment was trying to emerge against the Ghibelline autocrat, right? The papacy had probably no other option, but of course this wealth was instrumental, in fact, to provide with the means for now an external intervention of sort, because really nobody from, for example, the Pau Ballet was to essentially challenge Manfred's hegemony. Right? There is no power that can contrast the major regional Sicilian one and the one of his allies in the peninsula from from within the same Italy. The Germans are a bit more like they do not come to Italy at this point yet because Conrad has issues in Germany as well, but Sicily is quite enough, and Manfred is more than happy, as we've seen, to keep his half-brother out of the picture. The aforementioned bankers were granted special status as collectors of papal taxes. In other words, they were subcontracted those privileges that came as income that came with the execution of particular money collection, and were entrusted to use their financial means to assist those capable of contesting the power of Manfred and the Hohenstaufen dynasty in southern Italy, as encouraged by Clement. So, you know what will happen, but I would like to emphasize how relevant this international machination involving the Angevins was, because it entailed actually an incredibly risky expedition. When you look at the outcome, of course, you say, well, Charles of Anjou arrived, defeated Manfred, defeated Conradin. That's it. Also, this understandable hatred towards Charles of Anjou, who was the guy who really wanted the death of Conradin, which was one of the greatest crimes in medieval history, does bring bit like this bitterness with it that should not, however, sort of officiate the historical judgment, right? Charles of Anjou was a very capable leader, and what he did, besides this terrible thing, was, however, worth of praise, considering just the outcome of it, but also the risks that he took under. I mean, for example, the naval expedition from Provence to Rome by itself was something extremely risky, incredibly difficult, incredibly complex. The same campaign against Manfred, the later, like, just maintaining the control of the Neapolitan kingdom was incredibly difficult. We explained this in some videos I've recently made. Also on, in fact, the Angevin peace, the so-called Pax Andegavensis d'Italia, what followed so in terms of military coordination of the Guelph powers in Italy. This was happening at a time of peak of Ghibelline power as well, in a broader sense. So it took an enormous courage, capacity, and determination in order to achieve what Charles achieved, right? It's those Guelph Tuscan money and the papal support for this that fostered the strong and lasting connections between, in fact, the Curia, the House of Anjou, the Guelph party in Florence, that from, in fact, Charles' victory, we've seen it in the recent episodes about the history of Florence, will become the cornerstone of Guelph politics and strategy, as the tip of the balance of this enormous system stretching from the Channel to the Aegean, mostly hegemonized by the French, whether in the form, again, of the King of France, the King of Naples, plus all the other territories. I mean, the County of Provence. It was actually an imperial fief, by the way. There's so much going on, and these are here, especially the ones following this. I'm glad, again, we're talking about the 50s, the 60s of the 13th century, but really what happened later is underrated, right? Well, how the Guelphs, the Angevins, managed to establish this hegemony without weighing too much on the Italian communes as well. It's utterly insane, and again, it makes you wonder, because, again, the Ghibellines failed. I mean, I'm publishing, among the others, another article about Ghibelline mystics, so it's not like I'm not partisan in this, but you gotta give these guys their due. Also because, as I countlessly explained, like, you can't really say that there was a Guelph doctrine, wasn't there? I mean, the Ghibellines really believed, at least in something very traditionally etched into the souls of Europe at many levels, but it's not like the Guelphs, Dante Docet, I would say, weren't Ghibellines, right? The Guelph was someone more secularly aligned with the papacy. It's not like they didn't feel, I don't know, in the Italic kingdom, not to be imperial subjects or not wanting the emperor as a figure, right? There was actually always a very active dialogue with all parties involved. So you have rather to understand why these guys were actually fighting, and especially what they were fighting over. That is this immense wealth that the Tuscan Guelphs immediately understand, like, literally, like, the papacy nor Charles of Anjou had the money to repay to compensate for the expedition, for all the wealth that had been simply landed by these bankers, but the subcontract of the entire Sicilian grain shipping across Europe. You know that in the center of the Middle Ages, Sicily exports grain every freaking where. Europe, Tunisia, Egypt. I mean, in ancient times, you needed North Africa to import grain to Europe to sustain Rome, Constantinople. At this point, Sicily is just, throwing wheat at things every freaking where. Well, if you wonder where the Florentine Renaissance stemmed from, well, the enormous wealth coming from the subcontracting of the Sicilian grain exports, right? And Florence became literally the richest city in the globe in absolute terms, in apparently, so they say, like the one with life quality matching the one of the Antonine Roman, which is again, something a bit like comparing apples to oranges in my opinion. However, there are studies on this. If anything, we may look at them at some point. So the political events occurring between 1265 and 1267 acted as a catalyst for the emergence of this aforementioned Guelph, Papal, Angevin, Provençal coalition, French coalition at the end of the day. Although the foundation for it was laid by these earlier circumstances, the growth of wealth among Florentine enterprises in banking, trade, like along with the creation of stable currency for international trade through the minting of the silver grosso. Right, it was a very heavy, like loaded silver coin in 1236, and the gold florin, especially, that will be in fact the gold standard of European finance, currency circulation in medieval Europe from 1252 had created new possibilities for profit through money lending. The Saint Dante was the son of a money lender, even though they were aristocrats, they were knights. On their own, they were lesser nobility, but just think of the broader context, even in which that genius was arising. This generation of children born at this point, like, were to transform, as you know, also European literature, poetry, philosophy, politics. Like, we're talking about great geniuses in just even strictly artistical terms, but they were fighters. It's just like the German Minnesänger. They really incarnated that higher feeling, and we often don't appreciate the survival in the sense of the warrior bard in these cultures. Like, you think the warrior bard is mostly like, I don't know, a Gaelic thing, romantic Irish. The warrior bard was present across all Europe. What do you think that the Occitanian courtly poetry was about? You think it was just a weird, emasculated poet? You confuse the minstrels with the troubadour, with the Minnesänger, with the still novel. These were all knights. The Sicilian school of poetry, when does it happen? It happens at the court of Frederick II, the peak of the most magnificent Ghibellinism to be ever seen, right? Now, during the 50s of the 13th century, Pope Alexander IV supported the imperial candidacy of Richard of Cornwall, the brother of Henry III of England. I made a video about this. From the other side, as you know, there was Alfonso X of Castile, that had also some Swabian ancestry himself. He would never actually go over to Germany, unlike Richard, who did have, of course, like, he was just a sort of, not necessarily a puppet king, but he couldn't run Germany. The Germans had chosen him in many ways because he was as a foreigner, because they could do whatever they wanted with him. But he was involved, and he was also coming out pretty well, right? And there are these anecdotes talking to his brother Henry about the fact that there were so many warlike bishops in Germany that they should have copied the thing in England. By the way, there was once a time in which the St. Normans were not very far away. Bishops capable of smashing somebody with a mace. But hey, now Normandy was gone since Bouvines, so the English had to adapt. The other interesting anecdote is in all this that, for example, the Florentine bankers, of course, provided financial backing to assist with his election in Germany. But even more so, the fact that the papacy was searching these broader alliances and alignments to also determine who would have become King of Sicily after Manfred, in case he would have been finally taken out. This is interesting because it shows that the papacy was not, in fact, they would sort of repent of it later on. So confident about having Charles of Anjou next door. A massive Angevin power could be as oppressive as a Swabian one in Sicily. In any case, there were precautions taken as far as that. But there were other options in theory. For example, the Sicilian throne here was offered to Henry the Third of England's son, Edmund. There is very interesting English revival, saying possibilities of who could become the next king of Sicily. Again, we're habituated to the Normans. In this case, they would have been actually part of the same family if you really dig back in time. They were Angevin, but it's interesting, at least not by blood with Charles, actually also through the lineage of the French kings, but not through the counts of Anjou per se, because the French took over Anjou. In fact, that's how the Capetians were ruling there. But the point I was making, like, you have the Normans, you have the Germans, you have the French. Historically, it could have been the English, right? The English at this point later on with Edward the First, or actually Prince Edward still would participate to the ill-fated crusade of Tunis that actually the English contingent sort of brought to an end, in the measure at least they were the only ones to arrive in the Holy Land. It was a massive army. Also, the Aragonese fielded an impressive amount of forces. Like, this is really the peak of power. Hadn't the plague broken out in Tunisia, part of the problem was also Charles of Anjou that did not offer Sicily as a launch pad, as a basis of the operations. Likely Egypt would have fallen and Jerusalem would have been reconquered. So there is so much connected to all of this that is utterly insane. Just like the almost achieved reconquest of Constantinople by the Angevins, that failed because of the Sicilian Vespers, but would have happened as just like the death had prematurely struck Henry VI, the father of Frederick II. Constantinople would have fallen to the Germans. So there were we are in the 13th century. I made an entire video about how the West kicked ass all over the place at this point. But they also were pretty darn unlucky, right? And at large, when you look at this infight, you realize that had those resources been spent for this more concerted efforts, we would live also in a very different world. However, the reason why we were so powerful is that we could afford to do this as well, right? For becoming even more powerful in this regard. Nevertheless, in order to finance all these policies abroad, Florentine money had to travel far and wide, right? England, say Britain better overall, because there was a lot of in-gaming there as well. France. Naturally, the English were actually broke at this point. Henry III was providing with a lot of money himself, that, as you know, would trigger the later rebellion in his life. He had attempted all his reign not to have the civil wars that had been so scarringly in his father's and his previous generations' times for England. But now he was very much enticed by this opportunity of having his sons as kings of Germany, king of Sicily, that he promised so much money that he couldn't simply repay. Right. Later on, of course, the Florentine would finance the French, the English. Most of the Tuscan bankers would fund most of the wars out there, like for these rulers that also couldn't pay at a point, and were pretty important financial cracks that facilitated the spread of the Black Death because of the damage on the population, the spread of malnourishment, etc. But it's all that deeply intertwined. This is the moment in which Florence is, at least this wealth bankers that, as you've seen, are a bit working in the shades because they are not so politically invested now. The Ghibelline aristocracy rules, but the latter also need these guys to be active in the city. So you've seen you couldn't get rid of that practice, for example. But this is fatal also because the papacy ties with them and is able to reach these markets and making leverage on these countries, and especially found the expedition of Charles of Anjou. After the Ghibellines returned to Florence in 1260, Urban IV pressured merchant companies like the Spini, the Scala, and Mozzi's Spigliati branch, who had previously engaged in these transactions, to renounce their allegiance to Manfred, that they had in some way to pledge, like given the general temper after Montaperti, in fact, formally pledged loyalty to the church in August and December of 1263. This wasn't unseen, but wasn't also much that the broader regimes could do. Like these were, also bankers that had money elsewhere. Like this was real practice, the real. If there was a real economical revolution in the Middle Ages, was the introduction of banknotes that Italians start making work. And so this meant that you could move, the assets could remain where they were, you could exchange these pieces of paper and save an enormity of also logistical and costs for moving the actual assets. And so it was, of course, the obvious consequence of the level, however, of enormous wealth that these guys control. So they could become more international. It could be at the papal court, it could be elsewhere, it could also not be in Florence. But at large, they were Florentines. Also, they wanted to come back to Florence, they had properties and assets there. In a way or another, they also paid different groups, right? Now, these earlier actions set the stage for 1265, when Charles of Anjou, brother to Louis IX of France, was convinced to lead an army into Italy as the Pope's champion to remove the Hohenstaufen from southern Italy. The French had this previous experience with naval operations across the Mediterranean. Louis IX had been captured by the Saracens at Damietta in Egypt, and that had caused such a huge deal. Damat is basically at the mouth of one of the branches of the Nile. And, the objective there was taking over the Nile Valley. Cairo was done. Right? From there, they could have simply conquered Jerusalem. So France had proven, especially since the establishment of the Mediterranean port of Aigues-Mortes. If you visit southern France, especially you pass by the coast, I heartily advise you to visit it because it's beautiful. It's like how it was at the time. This was the first true, say, naval port of the Kingdom of France, given that it's under Louis IX truly and fully southern, say, Occitania proper is absorbed by the French proper. Like the Languedoc takes over the Languedoc. And this projects the French as the greatest power in Europe, of course, to launch this invasion of Levant, right? But southern Italy is more at hand, especially when you have the papacy that is going to give you full support from Rome. It's just a step from there. But it wasn't easy, as we were pointing out before. Strong collaborative ties formed between Charles, the exiled Guelph faction from Florence, and the city's merchant financiers who, relying on assurances of loan repayment from papal revenues, and the future Sicilian ones, in Charles' hands, financed the military campaign. Charles' victory over Manfred at Benevento, again one of the largest battles in the year and the most important, in 1266, the following year, enabled him to take control of Sicily, right, as a whole, right, Naples and Sicily. Eventually, the Angevins would shift the capital to Naples proper from Palermo. Actually, Manfred, this other, like the Hohenstaufen, had at large tended to privilege Apulia rather than Sicily. However, by this point, Sicily was relatively decaying, and Naples was closer to Rome. The Angevins had many reasons to just interfere, also, as we've seen with central northern Italian affair, and successfully so. So that was sort of more strategically and politically viable as an option. This is how the Florentine bankers who had founded Charles' campaign gained advantageous access to monopolies and tax collection in his newly acquired territories. This changes the history of the world forever. Right? The Guelph knights from Tuscany, who fought alongside Charles in the south, were also promised his support in their efforts to regain control of their commune, which they had been exiled. In an attempt to mitigate the repercussions of Manfred's defeat and death, the Ghibelline regime in Florence sought reconciliation with the Pope, culminating, as far as the Florentine institutional history is concerned, in the creation of a new magistracy of 36 members, which included some former Guelphs who had not been exiled, however. But it wouldn't last, right? Tensions arising between this council and the existing governing bodies sparked unrest, prompting Guido Novello and his supporters to withdraw from the city in haste, right? In other words, the Ghibellines abandoned quite quickly the scene, just like the Guelphs had done before, a bit more slowly, but still fast. This gives you a dimension also of the international, almost cosmopolitic mindset of this errant knights, what the exile meant. There is something very deeply connected with the ancient comitatus and the necessity of foreign adventures in order to properly regain control of power, as true warbanders that were exiled from the Zip and that now came up back like after the initiation of these major battles to control. Benevento, by the way, seems to have informed the Florentines about some of, however, what will produce themselves as the more complex tactics of the time. We're not aware really of multiple in-depth battle lines in Tuscan warfare before the Battle of Campaldino. It's not to be excluded that at Montaperti this may have occurred, but we're not really... We'll have to analyze the sources for that. But we don't know it with certainty. The point being that now the Florentines were really opened to that broader koine represented by France, French culture, at every level, politically, militarily, and socially, that the city enormously benefited from. Made recently that video about the Black Guelphs, like how they took over thanks to the French Neapolitan support. It's all a consequence of the Pax Andegavenses, so to say, that will also bring to the exile of Dante, but we are now 30 years later. But it did stem all from this. It stemmed from the most self-evident need of Florence to align, just in terms of sheer wealth interest, like into this broader horizon, from which, in fact, the city would actually rise to the point it was not subjected to the French. We've started with Frederick of Antioch. We could see there the literal iron fist that these essentially Italianate Germans or Germanized Italians, whatever, would want to impose on these communes. The Angevins, in all their political criminal activity like this in a broader dynastic international sense as far as the Hohenstaufen legacy and bloodline were concerned, did not rule with iron fist, did not even technically impose themselves on the cities. They had power sharing situations, generally speaking, like they supported them, but from this moment onwards, there's actually a great moment of peace and greater wealth spreading that will be foundational, paradoxically, in fact, also to later powers, especially in the early 14th century. There would be also Ghibelline, for example, the Mosque Guelph Milan that had fought against the Swabians, was going to become Ghibelline. So you have here, as we were saying before, like a broader Italian civilization that develops, with this Guelph and Ghibelline factionalism that at the end of the day responds to much more complex logics than just the dichotomy pro-empire, pro-papacy. Upon the return of the Guelphs to Florence, a tentative effort to reconcile the sides was made, because to an extent exiling people in general, even if they were your political rivals, did weaken the city. I mean, these people could not be taxed, for example, while they were there. Remember that they live as clans, as especially the Ghibellines, as with this course, they had their ways that would have contributed to the city's wealth, right? A city that was also under attack in this, as we've seen, inter-Tuscan local rivalries, was also weaker. Like, it had to be more compact to withstand this trouble. But this naturally, and this is arguably, in fact, the extent of the liberty that what was lost now in exchange for an Angevin protection, was disrupted. In fact, when Pope Clement IV designated Charles of Anjou as the general peacemaker in Tuscany, and when this ruler sent a contingent of French cavalry to Florence, which was just preemptively sent there, right? It wasn't like just to collect wealth. I mean, there was an agreement for maintaining these knights, but at large it was to prevent any kind of Ghibelline coming back. Hence also there, before the beginning of the 14th century, this unsettled business whereby there were now white Guelphs in Florence that were tendentially Ghibelline, were aligning with that side of the story that didn't want to have the Angevins really telling them what to do. And the black Guelphs that are booming in money just because of the connection with Naples, etc. And so that favors the banks, it favors this mercantile dimension that many white Guelphs, also as aristocrats, as noblemen, including Dante's family, would not quite like at that point, in spite of having fought against the Ghibellines back in the day. This is actually all very coherent if you put it on a timeline. But the fact that it would take literally 30 years to settle this matter shows you also how non-oppressive the Angevin system was compared to like what we've seen before, like the general Ghibelline regimes in Florence, that albeit of course maintaining some Guelph there, especially also their family, without even destroying the entirety of their possessions, whatever, was much more radical. Like either one or the other. This is not a good recipe for political stability, for income, for development. And this is in fact what we're observing about the Popolo before. The Guelphs have affirmed their own autonomy. Not even the French knights have that space in the city streets. Like the Germans, the Italian one wouldn't have it, not even the French. So at large, you can say that here the balance was tilting from quite a while in favor of this Guelph hegemony that was required externally, right? It's not like the Pope rolled the dice and simply chose Charles of Anjou. It was at large a matter of like who can keep, like, say, arrive in arms, etc., and how can we finance him, but for which purpose? What's the role in Italy? This is relevant because even as the papacy goes, they will recall, of course, even Rudolf of Habsburg. At that point, they would play the German card after the Interregnum, because the Angevins, so close to Rome, with Charles becoming senator of Rome, all that stuff, like, had become a bit toxic, right? It was a power affirmation, but even in that case, it's not like the Angevins decided ever to take over the Papal States or Tuscany. No, they didn't do that. They didn't. It wasn't just that level of plan. And that is very different compared to what basically the Swabians had done since the second half of the 12th century, uninterruptedly up to the day before, looking at this timeline. So this makes you think, right? This is something that, again, I'm not saying because I want to push you towards the Angevin side or the Guelph side. It's just something which, as a perspective, I've come to objectivize through this historical analysis, in that I've never fully, I've never seen being fully contemplated, right? And you have to sort of be a bit into the shoes of these Florentines. Like, what did you really want? Because, you see, the other option was continuous infight. It was not like, there wasn't a scenario here in which Manfred simply would hegemonize the situation without trying to impose a feudal force on it. It may be that, I don't know, in the longer run he would have played more cleverly than what the norm had been up to that point, for just this effort to reconstitute a properly Germanic rule, because that was the point. He was a Sicilian ruler now rather than else. He couldn't really even properly be an emperor himself. God knows what may have happened hadn't he, succumbed to Charles of Anjou, etc. But let's say that while the Angevins provided with an enormous induct, right, at this enormous background of, let's say, connection with France, with this Western Mediterranean dimension, Manfred was just self-referential. Yes, he had lots of allies around, mostly because the French were disliked by a bit everybody, like the Byzantines, the Aragonese. But at the same time, these powers wouldn't, in fact, prove to successfully orchestrate anything that could oppose, in fact, French power in the future generation. Even from Sicily, had Charles of Anjou been, a Manfred without the Capetian background, Sicily was very powerful, incredibly powerful, but in many ways it was still a medieval power and limited to that extent. So at this point you find the peak, and after some decade the gradual stalling and even shrinking of the great medieval civilization, which mostly consumed these enormous resources fighting against neighbors, and therefore consuming an incredibly large amount of those very resources that we have seen here for achieving some kind of hegemony. For example, Wood did break this order. Henry VII's expedition. There may have been the sympathies that I also have towards that enterprise, but at large, what did they bring? A whole new generation of warfare that is likely the largest seen in medieval times in regional interest, meaning that you can have the Mongols passing by and razing to the ground everything, but the level of power that Italy feels in sheer amount of forces, of wealth, of enormous armies is unmatched anywhere. Right? This is being heavily recognized historiographically at this point. And imagine if, say, the Angevin hegemony had sort of remained without any chance for these guys to simply take over. The papacy did try to have something to say, but against the Visconti, for example, but because these were a hotbed of revolt, they had sort of created a Ghibelline, de facto, tendentially regional power that was hostile to the papacy, etc. So surely this power would have not self-preserved itself forever, as also the realignment of the papacy, for example, with Rudolf of Habsburg shows. But evidently, up to that point, not bringing to such an escalatory and violent consequence like the one would happen with Henry VII, and technically anybody else who thought that from Germany, Henry was coming technically from France because the French part of the empire, but still from that imperial side. As long as there was some strong prospect of Ghibelline force backing the guys arriving across the Alps, which at this point really lacked. It wasn't just the fact that Germany was exploding and actually imploding as a monarchy, and so Rudolf of Habsburg, even from his objectively large power, would not go ever to Italy, even though he planned thrice or 4 times even a campaign. Every once in a while it was yet another problem, and he spent his life destroying princely German rebel castles, right? So they're mess up the order of adjectives in English, but in any case, I think you understand. So that's why I want to highlight this point, because if you think about it, and I was saying at the beginning, in these not even 20 years, everything changed, even in the perspective that you wanted to see the world from Florence, which is something that I don't think we are tendentially visualizing the way it really deserves. And I think that in general, whenever we look at these chapters, we should be extremely careful about any kind of transposition that is done of them in later times. Now. I don't say it much because I see it among you, but because I perceive that there are still insecurities regarding this. That, let's say, here I get questions like, I don't know, did people speak Latin in I don't know, in the Carolingian or the Ottonian Empire? Because I obviously make a Latin citation for the official formula of crowning of Otto the Great in a video. Like, I don't know how even, and it's not like the thing entails, like they're whining because they would like Latin not to exist. Fortunately, it does, and it does for the simple fact that it was the official language of any power, a Catholic, truly Catholic, Latin Germanic power at the time and beyond, also the entire Roman, because that's what it is. This is Roman Europe. Medieval Europe is Roman Europe. If you don't understand that, if you're here on this channel because you think that there is some strange regurgitation of ethno wishful thinking of some sort, like, I doubt that you are very well acquainted with history to begin with. And again, it's not like we don't make ethnic history. We make a lot of it, but we're doing it in a way that makes sense, not in a way that is what you would like other people to propagandize without knowing, by the way, that it's wrong. Like, or deep inside knowing that if these are the kind of questions, you don't know that much. Again, history is not really much of an option. But this is the beauty of it as well. You can't do without it, but you can always count on it. This is really the fantastic aspect of the story. And of course, there is always so much to learn, even just by observing how the whole system unfolds, right? If you are ever wondering how or why something worked in the past the way it did, history is self-explanatory, right? If you have doubts, it's because you haven't done your homework, right? I try to facilitate this process because I realize sometimes what the problems with this story, this interpretation is, right? I understand that. I know where you come from with it. I try to do my best, but if you don't help yourself, I can't do the thing for you. Understood? So that's extremely, extremely important. For the rest, as I was saying at the beginning, this content is an evergreen. We will keep talking about Florence. We will always be that attempt to this specific history, because without it, you can't really pretend to understand the rest. And the advantage of this all is that, again, you can always count on history itself and on all the videos that I've made on such topics that do deserve that specific consideration. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.